Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. Hope you had a wonderful Easter weekend. And as you were watching the Easter weekend, of course, you may have watched some sports. And, of course, those of you that are interested in college basketball, and I am, looking forward to that game tonight. Pretty exciting, really, when you look at some of those. Not as exciting for Baylor because that was a blowout from the beginning, but nevertheless, we'll certainly be watching that. And if you do pay attention to sports at all, and even if you don't, you may have noticed something. That is, the All-Star game is going to be moved out of Georgia, and that's all because, theoretically, we have such a restrictive election law. And, of course, this has caused a lot of us a little bit of concern. Matter of fact, around the group here, we all love baseball. Matter of fact, we have opening day in about, 2 hours here, and it's Toronto Blue Jays at the Texas Rangers. But my enthusiasm for baseball has changed dramatically. My enthusiasm for Coca-Cola and Delta has changed dramatically, and it kind of gets us into some of the articles that we have posted for you to hear about, and a topic that we will get into perhaps even in more detail in the next hour, because we'll have in studio individual that has actually written about this whole idea of woke corporations and the impact even wokeness is having on the gospel. So we'll get into that in more detail. But you have had everything from Major League Baseball to, of course, I just mentioned Coca-Cola. Some people now calling Woca-Cola, and Delta. And I can make you a further list, which we'll get to in just a minute in our articles. We're all talking about this restrictive law in Georgia. Now, I recognize that most of you do not live in the state of Georgia, but we do have Georgia listeners, and this, as I talked about the other day, is bigger than just the state of Georgia, because it illustrates only so well that once a lie gets started, especially when it's spoken by prominent individuals, other individuals pick it up, and especially when the woke mob comes after you, there is usually no attempt to come back to the basic facts. Let's talk about those real quickly before we take our first break. And the first is that you've had the president on more than one occasion argue that this law is terrible because, number one, it restricts the number of hours that people can vote, which is not true. Number two, it restricts being able to even give somebody water in the line when they are waiting to vote. Now, in case you wonder what people that have checked this out think about this, I'm going to hold up for those of you watching online. You might even be able to see that this says 4 Pinocchios. Who gave the president 4 Pinocchios? The Washington Post. That's on March 30th. And I'm just going to read from part of it because, after all, Glenn Kessler, who I know of and have read before and don't always necessarily agree, nobody can accuse him of being somebody who would be a supporter of Georgia Republicans, or of restrictive laws, but nevertheless points out, let's just look at the hours issue first. On Election Day, he says the facts are that polling places are open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. If you're in line at 7 p.m., you're allowed to cast your ballot. Nothing in the new law changes that. Well, that's not what the president said. He says this is limiting. Well, it goes back to something very interesting. Stephen Fowler of the Georgia Public Broadcasting, again, not necessarily a supporter of the Republicans, said one of the biggest changes in the bill would expand early voting access for most counties, adding an additional mandatory Saturday and formally codifying Sunday voting hours as optional. So that is the case. Well, didn't I hear the president say something about they're not going to be open after 5 p.m.? No, but if you read the law carefully, and I'm not sure that the CEO of Coca-Cola or the CEO of Delta has done so, but if you read that, you can look in the law where in the past it said voting shall be conducted during normal business hours. And normal business hours were assumed to be 9 to 5. What the law does is specifically say that normal business hours are 9 to 5, but that is just the minimum level. And as a matter of fact, any county can do what they want. As a matter of fact, if you go and look in Fulton County, for example, the early voting started at 8:30 and went to 6 p.m. on most weekdays and was 7 to 7 on Saturdays and other times during the week. And so when you look at all of the issue of the hours question, then I will just simply conclude with what Glenn Kessler of the Washington Post said. He said, not a single expert we consulted who has studied the law, there's the key, understood why Biden made this claim, as this was the section of the law that expanded early voting for many people in Georgia. Somehow Biden managed to turn this expansion into a restriction aimed at working people, calling it the most outrageous parts of the law. There's no evidence of the case. The president earns 4 Pinocchios. That is the first issue. Let me take the second one, because the other thing that you've heard the president say is that you can't give anybody any kind of water. Now, first of all, you've got to understand that this is all part of a concerted campaign. I found out that on March 10th, Stacey Abrams' group called Fair Fight Georgia registered a web domain which was entitled Jim Crow 2.0. Remember when all of a sudden in kind of the middle of March you started hearing Jim Crow 2.0? Matter of fact, you even heard the president say it's not even Jim Crow 2.0, it's Jim Eagle 2.0, whatever that means. I'd never figured that out. But nevertheless, then the argument is that there would no longer be an ability for people to get food or water while they're standing in the long lines in Georgia. Well, first of all, let's go back and look at the law. The new voting law allows food trucks at polling locations, and that is certainly still allowed. Food and water are permitted within 150 feet of the polling location, provided it's set up by poll workers. But outside that 150 feet, you can have food trucks, you can have bands, you can have anything as long as they stay 25 feet from the actual voter line. So in some respects, you might say, well, then why did they do that? Well, this was a prohibition against what's called electioneering. And that is, in the past, Democrat activists oftentimes were passing out food and water. I looked this one up. In 2018, there were activists with Planned Parenthood who had Planned Parenthood T-shirts on, passing out water and iTunes gift cards in one of the congressional races. Last year, you had activists passing out water with the group's logo on the water cups. And everybody said, you know what, that's electioneering, so we need to end that. But nevertheless, that is the case. And of course, the other argument has been, well, this actually restricts it. No, it actually adds 2 Saturdays, which I think is something that is far beyond what you have in many of these blue states, where some of these individuals are located, criticizing it. And, of course, then they say, well, they're restricting access. No, you can get an absentee ballot, but you have to do that at least 11 days before the election so that we can make sure we can get the absentee ballot to you. Makes sense, right? And, of course, instead of having the signature verification, now you use a number. And you say, well, if I don't have a voter ID number, well, then we'll give one to you free of charge. So nevertheless, those are the arguments. But when I come back, I want to get into what's happening to some of these corporations, which in the past just wanted to do business. Now they want to affect election laws. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In the process of evaluating a Supreme Court standard for the media, an appeals court judge also made a startling statement about the state of media in this country. Judge Lawrence Silberman is a senior judge in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals and may be best known for his opinion on the Heller decision concerning the Second Amendment. He argued that the landmark libel ruling in the New York Times versus Sullivan should be reconsidered. Back then, the justices raised the standard for suing a newspaper. A newspaper article had to be written with actual malice, which is defined as the reckless disregard for truth. You may even remember the 1981 movie Absence of Malice with Paul Newman and Sally Field that challenged this media standard. So why did he argue that the standard needs to be reconsidered? His answer is simple. The media has taken a turn for the worse and shown itself to be very irresponsible. He even went so far as to argue that the New York Times and the Washington Post are virtual Democratic Party broadsheets and that most of the working press usually follows their lead. The current standard makes it nearly impossible for anyone bringing a defamation case and hoping to win, especially if they are deemed a public figure. If your name is Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, Sarah Palin, or a long list of other political figures, you don't have a chance to win a suit and clear your name. Yes, it is true that CNN and the Washington Post did settle their suit with a Covington, Kentucky student, Nicholas Sandmann, but you have to wonder if the media organizations would have been more cautious without the current Supreme Court standard. I congratulate the judge for writing what most of us believe and have seen in the way the media currently covers important news stories. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, let me just talk a few more minutes about this idea of woke corporations, and then we're going to be changing topics for a little bit and talking with John Ringenberg about his book Illuminated, and I think it's going to be just a great opportunity for you to once again know how to kind of defend the Christian faith, and so we'll spend just a little bit of time with him before the top of the hour. And the next hour, we'll have Owen Strachan in, and we'll be talking about his book Christianity and Wokeness, how the social justice movement is hijacking the gospel and the way to stop it. So we'll talk about the book, but we'll also talk about a conference that he's going to be a part of, which you'll want to know about. And also we'll get into a little bit more about these woke corporations, because whether you live in Georgia or not, and I knew we have quite a number of listeners in Georgia, these corporations are starting to exercise political muscle in a way that we need to pay attention to. And if you can actually make your case, I'm all ears. But when you don't even know how to make your case and you're just reacting to the woke mob, that is not helpful. And because, as I think I've already pointed out, much of what has been said about this particular law passed in Georgia, signed by the governor, is not anywhere near the concerning that it should be for most individuals. It illustrates that a lie can spread all the way across the world by internet before the truth gets its boots on. And so let's get into that in more detail. This first article that I've posted here comes from Dave Seminara. I don't know of him. I just know that in the past he has actually said that even though the left boycotts products, he's kind of against that. understand that, because he even says, maybe I was wrong to think conservatives should refrain from adopting the bullying, boycotting tactics of the left. And what he does is take us through some of the products that he has actually used, which are now all taking a very different view from him. He talks about Coca-Cola and Delta, a pair of Atlanta-based companies I've patronized for many years, became progressive boycott targets this month for allegedly not doing enough to stop Republicans from passing the election security law. And he points out that in an interview on CNBC, the CEO of Coca-Cola, James Quincy, said the law was unacceptable, a step backwards, but could not explain why. And the host at CNBC actually pressed him on why Coca-Cola didn't actually publicly oppose this before. And even though he made his comments both on CNBC and Twitter, that apparently did not placate the woke mob enough. And so then you have the Delta CEO, El Bastian, pretty much reading from the, if you will, the script, in quotes, of Coca-Cola, came out and said the same kinds of things. And the point he's making is that you find more and more of these companies are actually taking stands which you don't really want them to take. You just want to buy their product. You want to just buy their service, but that's the case. And so he says, whether I look in my refrigerator or whether I look in my clothing, then he talks about Patagonia, which I'll skip just because it's a long, detailed one. And then he says, moving to my bathroom, well, he says, of course, I've just even getting a shave. Well, I got rid of Gillette a while back when the company released this ludicrously woke ad, which was decrying toxic masculinity. So instead, he had a new brand, which was called Harry's. And if you're not familiar, Harry's has been a sponsor for the Daily Wire. And then they decided that they didn't want to be around conservatives, and they left there as well. While he's in the bathroom, he talks about Pantene and Pantene shampoo, which released a commercial about the life of a young transgender girl and her lesbian moms. This one created a fairly significant amount of backlash. As a matter of fact, the ad itself had 6 times as many dislikes on YouTube as it had likes. And if you listen to me mentioning the other day, now YouTube has decided maybe they're going to pull off the dislikes button. I think partially because they don't like all the dislikes that are posted on the videos by the president and the vice president, but nevertheless. But interestingly enough, Pantene, even though they got 6 times as many dislikes as they got likes, they said, we are simply not going to back down. And so the point he's making is you just have more and more of these companies who you wish would just sort of stay out of the culture wars, but nevertheless seem to want to get into them up to their eyebrows. And so that's our first article. But the second one I did want to emphasize real quickly before we take our break, and that is by Kimberly Strassel. She's been on the program with us before. She writes for the Wall Street Journal, and she again goes through some of this and points out, since I haven't talked too much about Delta, Ed Bastian, who is the CEO there, also argued for it, and then posted a piece in which you had a number of executives, African Americans, including the CEO of Merck and the CEO of American Express, also expressing their concerns about what has happened in Georgia. And so then Kimberly Strassel in the 4th paragraph goes on to say, well, Nancy Pelosi couldn't be more thrilled. Democrats and activists long have honed their techniques for intimidating corporations. They successfully pressured companies into withdrawing contributions from free market groups and into embracing climate change agenda, from refraining from political contributions and into adopting new social investment criteria. And then they've been enlisting corporate America to help peddle this narrative, what she calls a false narrative about this particular legislation in Georgia, and then makes a connection between what's happening in Georgia and what's before the United States Senate. Because if you don't see all of these connections, you've got to recognize there's really an attempt to not only vilify what's happening in Georgia, but to use that to pass H.R. 1. Remember that piece of legislation that we encouraged you to express your opinions about in terms of those around. And so we find ourselves today in which you have all sorts of individuals making some pretty strong statements. Later in the article, which you can read in its entirety, they point out that there is the argument being made from some of these executives that even though the voters are allowed to use an ID, and the same kind of ID that you would need, for example, to get a vaccine, same kind of ID that you would need to get on a Delta airline. Okay, you with me on this? They can use those, but then the executives point out that there are some people in Georgia that don't have a license. True. And that then gets us into the vote and the actual legislation that says that voters can use a free state-issued non-driver ID, and those who lack one can fulfill the requirement with a Social Security number or even a copy of a current utility bill, bank statement, government check, or paycheck. Do you really think that none of those individuals have a bill, a bank statement, have never gotten a paycheck or even a check from the government? Just think about that for just a minute. And so she finally says that the CEOs of these corporations may think that virtue signaling will spare them from the left's boycotts or from the attempt right now by many of these Democrats to actually want to raise the corporate income tax. Next week, I have a commentary coming out about the infrastructure bill. I've already talked about the fact that in order to pay for the $2 trillion spending bill that this administration wants, they want to raise the corporate income tax. And maybe some of these companies think that if we virtue signal this way, maybe we won't have such an increase in the corporate income tax, which is ridiculous. But nevertheless, that maybe is their hope. The only problem with all the things I've been reading is they all assume that these corporations are doing this so that they can avoid any kind of flack from the woke mob. But as I've pointed out before, there are just enough individuals that have graduated from universities and have adopted some of this woke philosophy that they now sit on those boards or they are actually in managerial positions. And the argument used to be that, boy, when these kids get out of college and they hit the real world, well, they're going to change their views. You know what happened? Some of them got out of college, they got a job, and they kept those views, and now they've infused the corporate offices with those kind of views. So I'm not so convinced that everybody here is doing this because of the pressure from the woke mob. Some of them actually believe it. But as I've pointed out before, and we're going to take a break, if you want to understand that this is not true, simply recognize the fact that the Washington Post, hardly a conservative organization, Glenn Kessler, hardly a person who would agree with the kind of things that are oftentimes said here on Point of View. Nevertheless, when they looked at those claims, gave the president 4 Pinocchios, and frankly, they could give every one of these CEOs 4 Pinocchios for some of the things that they are saying. So you may not hear it in the mainstream media. Hopefully you'll hear it here on Point of View. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into some conversations that we're going to have, first of all, about what we can do to know how to defend the Christian faith. Then we're going to get into the whole issue of wokeness and the gospel. All that coming up right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about how to kind of make the case for Christianity and the gospel. I think you're really going to appreciate that. So often we talk about not only helping you know how to articulate a biblical worldview, but how to defend one. So I think this argument, which we're going to use for about a half an hour, will be really helpful to you in some of the conversations you might have. Then we're going to come back to this idea of wokeness. Matter of fact, the book, Christianity and Wokeness, how the social gospel and the social justice movement essentially are hijacking the gospel. So we'll be talking about that with Owen Strachan. Dr. Owen Strachan will be with us in studio, and we'll be talking about that. Of course, we've been also talking about some of these other issues that relates to the election law there in Georgia, but the issue is broader than that, so we'll spend some time getting into that just about a half an hour from now. But let me first of all bring to the microphone John Ringenberg. He is an individual who is retired from 42 years in newspaper management. He is the author of this new book, Illuminated, Help for Your Thought Life by Understanding How You Think. In a sense, it's sort of an elaboration of Chapter 3 in C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles. If you've ever read that book, you may understand that. He's a graduate from the University of Illinois. He's been with Gideon's, for example, as a member for 18 years, an avid reader of C.S. Lewis, and the author who joins us now by phone. So, John, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you for having me, Kerby.
Let's see if we can talk about this, because you start out by using a great thought experiment. That is, imagine somebody was given a gift of $10 billion, which is certainly something that people could imagine. Sometimes we meet billionaires, and there are some people on this planet that have that. But imagine if you were given that when you were born, even at the annual rate of return of 3%, you'd have $500 million a year. You'd have the rest of your life never have to even think about working. But you raise a good question. You know, how did you get that money? Who gave it to you? All sorts of things. And you've said, you know, there's a gift that's worth more than $10 billion, and that's the ability to think. And so you really kind of start the book out by saying, if we start thinking, and we even think about the idea of thinking, which sounds kind of funny, thinking about thinking, but that's really what you're having us do. If you believe that everything is a result of evolution, everything's a result of a cosmic accident, then why would you even trust the neurons running around in your brain if all you are is something that was an accident? But if you start with the assumption that God exists and gave you a mind to use, that leads to a different direction. So in some respects, you're taking many of these ideas that were developed in C.S. Lewis's book and producing a booklet about that, aren't you?
That's correct. I mean, when you think of what rational thinking is, I mean, it's the most phenomenal thing that exists in the universe. I would dare anybody to try to show me or tell me something else that exists in the universe that's more phenomenal than our rational thinking. So we got this gift from God of rational thinking, but we don't think about it very much. And that's the reason I wrote this book, is that, you know, I read Miracles a couple of times before, but I never really understood what C.S. Lewis was talking about in Chapter 3. And then the last time I read it, several years ago, I started getting that idea of what is he trying to say here? And I kind of started seeing what he was saying, and I thought, well, wait a second. If what he's saying is true, then our rational thinking proves that the supernatural exists, and that something in the supernatural enables us to think. So I did about a 2 to 3 month study on that chapter, and I broke it down, put it back together again, and I determined that what Lewis was saying is true, and it's irrefutable. So it proves that the supernatural exists and it enables us to think, and that's really significant. That's really important. I was wondering, why haven't I've never heard this before. Why didn't I not hear this before? So I thought, well, I went on the internet and I looked, and there has been discussion about this idea. It's called the argument from reason, but it seems to be contained in upper level philosophy courses at major universities. Well, I thought, well, this is too important to keep locked up in philosophy courses. So I took the notes that I had made during that study, And I thought, if I can put these notes together, these notes help me to understand what Lewis was talking about. If they could help somebody else to understand what Lewis was talking about, then that would be good. So I wrote the book.
Well, and again, I think what you're doing is taking even some of the ideas of C.S. Lewis, who is trying to put these down at a level for the popular audience, but bring them down to one further level where I think most of us tend to live. And I think in some respects, the argument that C.S. Lewis made years ago is now being made more cogently by people that believe in like intelligent design. I mean, one of the arguments being made by evolutionists right now is there's no mind, there's just a meat computer, this brain. Well, if that's the case, as you point out, then why should I trust any of the thoughts that are coming through this meat computer? Because it's all basically a result of evolution. It's all the result of a cosmic accident. But if you start from a different set of assumptions, that indeed there is a God and that God gave us the ability to think, to ration, and to perceive him, then you have an answer. And the difficulty that our atheist friends have right now is they keep trying to make arguments as if our brains and minds mean something when they accept kind of an evolutionary idea that says they shouldn't mean anything to us. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree. Yes, I would agree. So, there are naturalists out there. And, for example, Sam Harris, says in his book, Free Will, that we do not have free will because we do not make choices. And we do not make choices because naturalism demands this cause and effect process for everything that we think. Well, if we think, let's say, about fire, we might think, well, fire, smoke. Okay, there might be a causal connection there. Thought A might cause thought B. But if we think rationally, thought B does not follow thought A in a naturalistic way. Thought B follows from thought A. Well, if thought B follows from thought A, I'm very much involved in that thinking process. I'm making inferences, I'm drawing conclusions, I'm thinking about concepts like if and then and must, and I'm trying to grasp grounds for believing assertions are true. So I'm very much involved in that process. Well, if that process doesn't meet the demands of naturalism, then it's not a naturalistic phenomena.
Yes.
It's got to be a supernatural phenomena. And that's what Lewis is pointing out. That, and he also points out that rationality must come from rationality. In order to get rationality, you have to get a source, a cause that is rational. So Lewis states that that a supernatural agent must be involved in how we think, and that supernatural agent must be rational. And then he takes the rest of the book, Miracles, and he says the most logical answer of who that supernatural agent is the God of the Bible or the God of Christianity.
Sure. If you think about C.S. Lewis, he so many times talked about just situations like that if you travel the globe and don't find anything that meets all of your needs, and you constantly are looking for more, maybe that suggests that you were made for more than earth. You were made for something supernatural. Yes. And you use a good example comparing us to deer. Since we're coming to a break, I'll just use this real quickly, and maybe we can talk about it after the break, because you might say, and I love this, if I have an empty feel in my stomach, well, I go to the kitchen, open the refrigerator, start putting something in my mouth. But a deer might have the same response. Well, we've been looking at a refrigerator, but so that's a hunger response. So that's where we're similar. If you hear sounds that you don't recognize, well, then you start being a little more alert to possible danger. And a deer will do that as well. But the example you just used a minute ago, if you see in the distance a blackish gray plume, you think smoke, you think fire. A deer sees it but doesn't make that inference. And so it's just a simple way, and I'm simplifying actually a couple of pages of what you talk about there, where when people say we're no different than the animals, yes, we are. And just the way in which we think, the way we come to conclusions, the issue of inferences, all, I think, illustrate the fact that we were made by a supernatural creator, and there's a supernatural part of our nature. When we come back, we'll continue talking about Illuminated, help for your thought life by understanding how you think. An elaboration of Chapter 3 of Miracles. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
John Ringenberg with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Illuminated. And it really gets into so many other very powerful arguments, and I thought we'd post one or two. You have a section here on the evolution of the eye and the brain. It is interesting that if you ever take the time to read Darwin, and especially The Origin of Species, don't recommend it. It's long, it's boring in some respects because it was written in the 19th century. But nevertheless, Darwin struggled with something, and that was the eye, because he recognized that for an eye to be effective, you need so many different parts coming together. And so we can see this sort of on the macro level. You need iris and a cornea and an optic nerve and all sorts of things to come together. Of course, that has been more formalized by, say, Michael Behe's been on the program, Darwin's Black Box, this idea of irreducible complexity, because at the microscopic level, level, we have that kind of issue. But it has become a real significant challenge to evolution. And as you point out, the evolution of the eye is something that really gave Darwin cold shudders. And he tried to come up with in an entire chapter how to explain that. I don't think it convinced too many people. But now when you look at the brain, back then, they didn't know a whole lot about the brain. But, John, we know a lot more about the brain than we ever knew before because of all the studies that have been done in which you have an enormous number of neurons, a number of connections. And the fact is that we have all sorts of memories, all sorts of very fast moving decisions being made in our brains that rival even the fastest computers that we have around the world. So in some respects, whether we look at the brain or we look at thinking, these are really becoming, I think, fairly powerful arguments for the belief in a supernatural, aren't they?
Well, I think so, absolutely. And I think what Lewis's argument is that even though the brain and the eye have evolved or become, what they are, which would be very difficult to achieve even with an evolutionary process. Lewis's argument is that the brain, you could make a case that the brain, through this evolutionary process, became an agent for sending messages in the nervous systems throughout the body for a response to stimulus kind of mechanism. But you cannot make a case for the brain becoming an entity that can think rationally on its own as a physical mass of molecules. And that was my point in the book, is that, why would we, if the eye could never think to itself about light, why would we ever think that the brain would ever have the capability to think to itself, I am thinking? And my point at the end of that chapter is, there's nothing in the universe that could ever come to the place where it could become a rational entity, a rational thing that thinks on its own.
And again, a lot of people that maybe have said, look, I've never taken a philosophy class, and I don't even know who Descartes is. I've heard I think, therefore I am, but I don't even know what that means. But nevertheless, there are just some obvious kind of issues associated, like you said, with the brain. Because you now have people doing brain studies, and they say, well, no, I can tell when you're angry. Okay, you can tell that maybe this part of my brain is warmer and shows up on a CAT scan as red. Can you tell me what it is that's making me angry? No, because that's a thought. And the thought is not material. And you start having all sorts of challenges. So there are people right now with a lot of hand waving saying, oh, we've been able to figure out brain states and everything. So we can explain all of this. And all you have is a meat computer up there. And you think you have free choice, but you don't have free choice. But I think even if you don't want to get into all the aspects of philosophy or neurophysiology and the rest, you still say you're holding to a view that doesn't seem to correspond with reality, because you act as if you do have choices. Some of these leading evolutionists right now say, I'm going to try to argue you into believing that evolution is true. Well, if I'm just basically don't have a choice, then I just biologically am conditioned to believe in creation rather than evolution, according to your view. And yet they go on to try to make the arguments and the cases for this. And so in some respects, your piece is maybe looking a little bit philosophical, but it's just kind of helpful in the fact that when I interact with people every single day, they may say they deny that we have a soul or a spirit. They may deny that we have a mind. They may deny that we actually make rational choices and that we make choices at all. But they live as if all of that is true. And so in some respects, that's why your book and that's why C.S. Lewis's arguments and so many others are so powerful. So if somebody says, okay, I haven't read Miracles, maybe that's the first assignment. Go read C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles, especially Chapter 3. If they want to contact you, how can they do so?
Well, they can buy my book on my website, which is illuminated-book.com. Or if they'd like to email me, I'd love to get their emails, and that is illuminated.book@gmail.com. So website illuminated-book.com. Email is illuminated.book@gmail.com.
So again, we have some of that information here at Point of View. And if nothing else, I know you passed the book on to me, but I thought it's a very powerful argument because whether you understand all the science and the philosophy behind it, I think there's a bottom line, and I think I gave that just a minute ago. People say they don't believe, if they believe in evolution, that we really make rational choices. And then they go out and make rational choices every day. People say that I am convinced that there is no mind, it's just a brain, it's just a meat computer. And then they make choices all the time as if they believe that there is a soul, a spirit, and that we are held responsibly for some of those actions. So if nothing else, I think it was a delightful little booklet that you've put together. And if people want to contact you, maybe have you come and speak or know a little bit more, they can contact you. And if nothing else, John, thank you for sending the book, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby. Appreciate it.
We have been spending so much time in these last couple of years helping you know how to make a case on of course, the authority of the Bible, the deity of Jesus Christ, even the arguments for the fact that we indeed as Christians are created in God's image. And I just thought that would be just another help in that regard. After we take a break, we're going to come back and help you make the case about what about this idea of wokeness and these woke corporations and all these things that we're seeing. There's a conference coming up, which we want you to know about. There's a book that is out that we're going to be talking about as well. And most importantly, if in the last half hour or so when I was talking about some of these woke corporations, maybe you have some comments or questions or observations, we hope that you will give us a phone call. That number, of course, is 1-800-351-1212. As you go to the website, you'll find out more about some of the things we'll be talking about in the next hour. But most importantly, I might just also point you to my commentary today, which has the title Media and Malice. And it's based upon something we talked about last week. You have the judge, who's the senior judge in the D.C. Circuit Court, Judge Lawrence Silberman, who's actually saying that maybe the Supreme Court needs to reevaluate the standard by which you can sue people for defamation. And the reason he says that is because he is convinced, if nothing else, that the media has taken a turn for the worse and made the very compelling argument that in the New York Times and the Washington Post have turned into virtual Democratic Party broadsheets. And so I thought you might want to read that and see his case and see, if nothing else, the reason why we talk about media bias and encourage you to listen to Point of View. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Today we're going to be talking about wokeness, and we're going to be doing it for a couple of reasons. There's a book coming out in the future, which is called Christianity and Wokeness, and that is one I want you to be looking for. And we even have a link so that you can pre-order it, so I would highly recommend that. And also, there is a conference that I suspect many of you are going to want to attend, and it will be taking place June 11th and 12th, and we'll talk more about that. And that one actually has the title Wokeness and the Gospel. You can find out more about that at wokenessandgospel.org. We'll get into all of that in just a minute, but in order to facilitate this, we are privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Owen Strachan. He is the Associate Professor of Christian Theology at Midwestern Seminary up there in Kansas City. Great institution. I've been there before, know a number of people that have taught there over the years. He's also the director of the Center for Public Theology, published more than 20 books, and it is just a delight to have you sitting across the table from me.
Thank you so much, Kerby. Great to be here today.
We are going to talk about the conference first, but occasionally I'm going to mention your book because you don't mind getting that book out there, and I suspect it's going to be a book that a lot of people are going to want to know about. But I guess back to the issue, we talk about these woke corporations, and you couldn't have picked a better time. We've been talking about woke corporations like Coca-Cola and Delta, and now the Major League Baseball even getting into all of this.
Yes.
And so this is a big issue, but I guess we're going to be using the word wokeness, so maybe a definition to start with. Can you help us out?
I can. You're hearing this term everywhere, but it's rarely defined.
Yes.
And basically the term woke means that you are awake to the true nature of systemic injustice in America in particular. And so you see not only the bad system and its setup in this country, but then you also are awake to the need for racial justice. So when you are woke, you see the problem as it is. America is shot through with what is called systemic racism. And then you see that the solution is going to be opposing that systemic problem through means of policy, governments, and these sorts of means.
And again, some of that relates maybe to critical race theory. We've had Dr. Doug Groteis, good friend, actually used to be with me at Pro Ministries and now at Denver Seminary, doing a critique of that. And part of the problem with whether it's critical race theory or white fragility or white supremacy or whatever is the idea that because everything is so systemic, even if you use what we're going to be using, logical arguments, those can be dismissed out of hand because you're just using that to reinforce a systemically racist institutions, right?
Exactly. Even reason, morality, logic itself is a tool of oppression. And that's because the woke system driven by critical race theory is a formal ideology. Fundamentally boils down to this. Lots of complex things to sort out and background issues, but it boils down to the idea that the world is divided into oppressors and oppressed people. Mm-hmm. And that is an insight, so-called, that flows from Marxist thought. And it's applied throughout the last 150 years or so to different sectors of society. Today it's being applied to those who are white or who are complicit in the system of whiteness. And so if you are white, in air quotes, or if you don't sufficiently challenge that system, then you are effectively an oppressor. And if you're a person of color, or somebody who's targeted in some way by this system, then you're an oppressed person. That is fundamentally the idea that we need to understand here.
And again, with the idea of oppressors and victims, it's beyond even the issue of race. I mean, Karl Marx talked about those who are oppressed, and that would be those who are the working class. But some other Marxists, like Antonio Gramsci, if you're familiar with him, and others have said, oh, no, it's any kind of oppression. So then you can say that you are more significantly oppressed if you're African American, lesbian, transgender, something like that. That gets us into one other word, intersectionality, because then you have, if you will, additional kinds of oppression. Is that fair?
That's exactly right. It's the idea that the oppressor-oppressed dynamic relates to all these other areas of life. And if you have power or authority in some form, then you are effectively an oppressor here again. And if you don't have it, then you're an oppressed person. The term intersectionality means at base that there are minority peoples, underprivileged peoples whose interests intersect and should make common cause together. And if they make common cause together against white, heterosexist, patriarchal authority in culture, capitalism, throw that in there as well, then what will happen is that order will be overthrown and will create a just society. And that is exactly what we have been seeing play out in this country, not so much in the formal classroom setting, but in the past summer with these riots and Black Lives Matter marches and these sorts of explosive events. A fair number of people participating in those actually did think that they are rightly destroying this wicked American order that needs to be torn up.
And I think that's one of the mistakes that people made. And I'll even say maybe I did it first, because when we heard about George Floyd, I said, okay, this is an issue we need to address. And that is, there may be some structural problems with the fact that sometimes the police protect their own, and individuals that are there might need to have greater accountability. And so we spent some time talking about that, and it began to be more and more obvious. The issue was not trying to have greater accountability within law enforcement. The issue is we want to get rid of law enforcement. And you started hearing things like defund the police. And you began to hear people saying we want to overturn everything, the traditional family, the free enterprise system. And so you begin to realize that this is really calling for something that looks more like a Marxist revolution, but it's sort of a cultural Marxist revolution that goes through the institutions rather than what Karl Marx actually taught about and what I had to read about when I was in graduate school, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. Look, we all should oppose racism and police brutality in an evil form and these sorts of problems that are real problems that rear their head because of the real problem of human sin. We know that people are partial to one another. We know that people judge one another for a variety of reasons, including skin color. We know that American history has massive failing in it in terms of slavery and Jim Crow, segregation, lynching, and so on and so forth. So we're not in a conversation between those who will recognize those real failings in the American past and those who will deny them. No, we all recognize there is much to sorrow over in the American past. But here's the deal. Wokeness argues today that same racist evil is very much as much alive and present in our society as it used to be in the days of slavery and Jim Crow. And so therefore we are justified, as we were just both talking about, in demolishing this society and attacking it at its very roots and undermining the major institutions that God has created in this world. And that is fundamentally not what we thought it was early in summer 2020. There's something deeper. There's darker magic going on here than we thought.
We're going to continue talking about that. And if you would like to join the conversation, in just a few minutes, we will open up the phones because we've been talking about woke corporations and wokeness and much more. But let me just mention that we have in studio with us today Dr. Owen Strachan. And if you find yourself saying, I know some people that need to hear this, and we're going to, of course, as we always do, have a podcast that you can make available to your friends, neighbors, maybe your kids, your grandkids, but also this will be on YouTube, so you'll be able to pass that on. But we also, when we come back, want to talk for a minute or two about this conference, because I think I've got hundreds of people already signed up, but we don't want you to miss out. It'll be taking place June 11th and 12th, so get something to write with, and we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In the process of evaluating a Supreme Court standard for the media, an appeals court judge also made a startling statement about the state of media in this country. Judge Lawrence Silberman is a senior judge in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals and may be best known for his opinion on the Heller decision concerning the Second Amendment. He argued that the landmark libel ruling in the New York Times versus Sullivan should be reconsidered. Back then, the justices raised the standard for suing a newspaper. A newspaper article had to be written with actual malice, which is defined as the reckless disregard for truth. You may even remember the 1981 movie Absence of Malice with Paul Newman and Sally Field that challenged this media standard. So why did he argue that the standard needs to be reconsidered? His answer is simple. The media has taken a turn for the worse and shown itself to be very irresponsible. He even went so far as to argue that the New York Times and the Washington Post are virtual Democratic Party broadsheets and that most of the working press usually follows their lead. The current standard makes it nearly impossible for anyone bringing a defamation case and hoping to win, especially if they are deemed a public figure. If your name is Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, Sarah Palin, or a long list of other political figures, you don't have a chance to win a suit and clear your name. Yes, it is true that CNN and the Washington Post did settle their suit with a Covington, Kentucky student, Nicholas Sandmann, but you have to wonder if the media organizations would have been more cautious without the current Supreme Court standard. I congratulate the judge for writing what most of us believe and have seen in the way the media currently covers important news stories. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Owen Strachan, and like I mentioned before, we do have information that you may want to pass on to others, but let me also talk about the occasion for this conversation. There's a book coming out, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes, but there's a conference that you may want to sign up for. I think I've heard you got 500 people or something like already have signed up. Mm-hmm. The conference is called Wokeness and the Gospel, and it takes place at Denton Bible Church. So you can go to dentonbible.org, but I have a better link for you. And that link would be just to go to Wokeness and Gospel. Leave out the, just wokenessandgospel.org. And of course, one of the speakers you might mention, of course, is Owen, who's in studio with us, Daryl Harrison, of course, Pastor Tommy Nelson, we've known him for years, Pastor Tom Buck, as well as Pastor Rodney Brown, who actually is in the viewing studio. We need to get him in here, maybe to say something. And then Charles is here as well, Pastor Charles Stolfus. So this is a conference that is going to be taking place June 11th and 12th. Now, you have people coming from all over the country, but I want to give people an advance notice. I think we're going to be out of some of the COVID restrictions by then. Mm-hmm. In fact, I noticed almost all of you walked in here without masks, so I think we're doing okay now, and we're going to be doing a lot better in June. And this is just going to be an incredible conference. So give us a sense of what this is, because the issue is wokeness and the gospel. It also relates to your book. A lot of people say, well, all that woke stuff, but it's affecting the gospel too, isn't it?
Oh, it surely is. This is basically the world's first conference on wokeness. So this is everywhere. I mean, you got Coca-Cola employees sitting and listening to a LinkedIn training session, and they're being told, literally, direct quote, to try to be less white. Try to be less white. I mean, this is where we are today. You can't be in an HR training session and not hear wokeness. So this conference is aimed at strengthening especially God's people to understand what wokeness is as an ungodly ideology. 2 Corinthians 10 and Colossians 2 speaks to how we engage that. And then secondly, understand how the gospel is better, speaks a better word than anything wokeness says about oppressor-oppressed dynamics or any other subject we can talk about. So Wokeness and the Gospel as a conference in early June at Denton Bible Church is going to be a great conference for pastors to come to, but it's also a conference for anyone who wants to get equipped and think well as a Christian about the dominant ideology taking people captive in 2021.
That gets back to Colossians 2:8, doesn't it? Because I think what I'm hearing you say is we've been taken captive by wokeness, by one of these false ideas that Paul talked about. Now, back in the first century, those false ideas were Gnosticism and a variety of other ideas and ideologies, but this wokeness idea, and we've even had people that wouldn't necessarily be able to even sign the doctrinal statement of Denton Bible Church, for example, where this is going to be held, who nevertheless are saying, politics has become the new religion. So in some respects, if you need a catechism for this new religion, wokeness might be like that. What's your thoughts?
Oh, it totally is the new religion of our day. This is it. This is the dominant ideology. You can't turn on ESPN without being indoctrinated in one form or another in wokeness. You're seeing it on the backs of athletes' jerseys today. I mean, I watch English Premier League soccer of all things, and the players are still kneeling out of deference to woke ideas. So this is everywhere. This is on Pinterest. This is when you're shopping. This is when you go to the mall. You're seeing this all throughout the culture and society. And so people need answers. So again, this isn't a conference for egg-headed people who love to talk until 2 a.m. in the morning about ideas. I am one of those people, one of those weirdos. But this is a conference for people who are seeing this ideology seep into our culture and take people captive, and don't want to be taken captive because they shouldn't be. They need to be taken captive by Jesus Christ, the true King.
And one of the things that we did last week is I'm trying to provide people tools for discernment. So we did an entire hour just on critical thinking. And matter of fact, there have been 2 of those, but we did a whole hour just on that one. And then we followed it with an hour on discernment, and especially biblical discernment. Even last hour, we spent a little bit of time trying to talk about the tools of how you would argue or discuss the whole issue, basically, of apologetics and those kinds of things. So this is going to be helpful to understand what's happening in the corporate world. But Owen, let me ask you a question. Is wokeness making its way into the evangelical church at all?
It's so sad to say, but it definitely is. And part of what wokeness does in its deception is it traffics off of that real tragedy in the American past that we've already talked about, and it touches on that dimension in every human heart that has a capacity for racism or partiality or evil of any kind. And it says, see, look at that hideous example in American history of lynching or whatever you're thinking about. That same capacity is operative today in the same way. Ibram X. Kendi, one of the leading woke theorists, for example, as you're well up to speed on him. He's at Boston University, and he has said the most threatening racist movement in America today, he says this in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, the most threatening racist movement in America today is not the alt-right and its drive for a white ethno-state, right? True white supremacists, old-fashioned white supremacists. Hideous movement. But the most threatening movement is the normal American's drive for a race-neutral society. Now, what he's doing there, actually in that section of his book, he's critiquing Martin Luther King Jr. with his famous speech on his children being judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, right? This is what I was raised in America to hear as a positive principle, positive value. So many kids were in my generation. And yet now that's being overthrown. And that's actually, that kind of mentality is being basically said to be racist because it doesn't challenge the underlying structures of power. So, Kerby, to speak more clearly here, this is a very clever and deceptive movement that is not actually opposing racism. In the end, whatever the motives of the evangelical pastor or preacher or layperson, it's actually creating racism.
Well, and one of the people that sat in that chair is Dennis Prager. He's a little taller than you are. Matter of fact, he hit every one of the lights in the studio. He's big. But he made the case that now even saying that there is only one race, the human race, is racist itself. And isn't that really what the Bible says? Because we're all of, what, one blood?
One
Isn't
blood.
That what, yeah. So even now saying that I believe in the human race is enough to be called racist. And anti-racism really sounds racist. Is that fair?
Yes, it is. Basically, anti-racism is a kind of works-driven religion where you can never change your nature. In fact, that's not even the goal. The goal is for you to acknowledge your disposition as a racist. You can never overcome it. All you can do are works that will oppose your racist nature, basically. And so Kendi has made a mint off of this idea. And sadly, again, evangelicals are parroting these ideas that we need to embrace anti-racism. That's the way forward. That is not the way forward. The way forward is Ephesians 2:11-22. It is the gospel of divine grace. It is there being one new man in Christ Jesus by the blood of Christ Jesus, such that the Apostle Paul, who was a terrorist against Christians before he was converted, if anyone ever should have paid reparations, by the way, it was the Apostle Paul, but he never says a word about that. The Apostle Paul tells us the solution for hostility and alienation that divide peoples, including covenantal division between Jew and Gentile, but division of every kind, is the blood of Jesus Christ.
What about this idea that whether it's Kendi or whether it's white fragility or a variety of others, you never get to the point of even being zero and even? You mentioned Ephesians. How about Ephesians 2:8-9, that we are saved by what? Grace, not by works. The whole gospel of grace could be completely obliterated by this idea of wokeness. Is that fair?
Oh, it definitely is fair. If you embrace this system, you will not see fellow Christians in terms of their standing in Jesus Christ, in terms of their God-given faith, born-again faith in Jesus Christ. You will see them in terms of their skin color. This will affect people in very practical ways. Here we are talking about these fancy theologians and ideas and schools of thought and all this, and we should talk about that. But in reality, what wokeness will do is it will target so-called interracial marriages. It will target adoptions where there's different skin colors in the home. It will target friendships. It will target church membership, and it will corrupt and poison relationships, such that people who thought they were bound together in different forms, especially by the gospel of grace, will now think, wait a minute, my spouse is white and I am black, so-called, and that must mean that my spouse is an oppressor of me, and I'm oppressed by them. Wokeness is doing this, and that's what we mean by Colossians 2:8, by citing it. It will take you captive.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to take some phone calls. That number is 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you want to go to the website that we're recommending, wokenessandgospel.org, or of course you can go to dentonbible.org, either way go get there, but that is probably easier. There's also a little bit of a video there. It's about a minute long, and there's a share button, so you could post that on your web page or your Facebook page or your Twitter feed or something like that and educate some people. But since calls are coming in, I might as well open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Owen Strachan with us, and if you would like to talk with Owen and get some perspective, we would welcome your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Owen Strachan with us, and we are talking about the Wokeness and the Gospel Conference, but you can go to wokenessandgospel.org. You can find all the information that you need right there. The phone number, 1-800-351-1212. And let's, if we can, head out first to South Carolina on the Good News Network. Dave, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, good afternoon, Ben. Maybe I'm oversimplifying this. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I believe when it all boils down to is you have global communism versus Western Christianity, and they oppose whatever we as Christians stand for and believe. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think there's part of that. In some respects, this is broader than communism per se. It's kind of Marxist ideas. But that's a good example, Owen, where Marxism is kind of morphed. It's very different. And I think what Dave's talking about here is kind of this idea, this kind of a confrontation of Christianity, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true in the framing you just gave, and that for the last 150 years in Western history, basically, the oppressor-oppressed dynamic has been used against a broadly Christian system. And so Marx is attacking that at the economic level. And then in the mid-20th century, you have cultural Marxism that really starts to pick up steam. And then today it takes a racial form. And so the oppressor-oppressed dynamic, which is used as a hammer against the church and against the family and against different institutions that God has created, is definitely a major competitor to the church today. And not enough people see that connection. But yes, these systems have consequences. Ideas do not land softly like wokeness. It is having a major effect. And we need to recognize that this is first and foremost a threat to Christ's church, but it is also, yes, absolutely a threat to society. It's a threat to government. It's a threat to the body politic itself.
And again, you've already talked about kind of the division in society, but come back to the issue of the church, because again, that's the title of the conference, Wokeness and the Gospel. What should people be looking for if they're in a church service and the pastor takes a passage and then starts moving into discussions about race and gender and division and those kinds of things? Are there some kind of key words or things to look for if all of a sudden I'm wondering if this church or this denomination is going woke?
That is a great question. There definitely are. The oppressor-oppressed pairing that we've now mentioned several times is definitely one of the tells. Also, just be looking for how your pastor, church leader addresses issues of race, in air quotes, because I don't believe there is such a thing, just to be clear here, as race. There is one human race. There's one blood, Acts 17:26, and then there's different ethnicities, to be sure. There are ethnicities that you can find all throughout the Bible. There's different Greek terms, ethnos and laos, and others we could mention. So there's such a thing as ethnicity, being from somewhere. But being of a different ethnicity does not make you a different version of humanity. So note how your pastor or the preacher treats these issues. And, for example, this is an actual real-life occurrence. If your pastor indicts white people as guilty of white privilege or even stronger, white supremacy, and then calls for white people, all of this is in air quotes, to repent of their whiteness and their complicity in systemic injustice just by virtue of their skin color, I mean. Because we know anybody can do a racist or ethnocentrist act. Any of us can. These are real issues today. But if your pastor indicts an entire category of people because of the color of their skin and says they're extra special sinful, that is wokeness in full color. And that is a church, and I would encourage people to think very hard about this. That is a church. I pray you can engage that leadership well, and hopefully the church will be recovered for the full biblical counsel. But if that church continues to preach that kind of unbiblical doctrine, it is going to be time for you to find a new church.
Wow. You said something in passing I thought I'd pick up for just a minute. You know, I wrote a book on Christian ethics, and that's like 16 years ago, so it makes me feel old. But I've got a chapter here on race and racial issues. Mm-hmm. And people might say, well, you're using your Bible to say that race doesn't mean anything. Mm-hmm. But I start out by reminding you that if you use science, After all, follow the science. They have concluded that if you look at races all over the world, take the two most dramatically different, maybe an Australian Aborigine and maybe somebody in a Nordic country, the difference genetically between the two would be maybe 0.2%, and even that is 94% within race variation. So we're already starting to see situations in which people can honestly say that race doesn't mean a great deal. And even back then, I was talking about a golfer by the name of Tiger Woods, still in the news, I guess. Thai, black, white, Chinese, Native American. Which particular boxes do you check? With the amount of interracial marriage and everything, race is becoming less significant scientifically. It never was significant biblically. And so that is kind of an interesting phenomenon unfolding right before our very eyes while there's such an emphasis through wokeness on race.
That's exactly right. Ken Ham has done good work on this issue biblically and scientifically. I cite his work in my book, Christianity and Wokeness, coming out this July. And you're exactly right. The differences between people who have admittedly different skin color, and that skin color, that difference in skin color and pigmentation, to be more specific, by the way, is given by God. That's not a negative thing. That's not a bad thing. God loves diversity. Christians have an infinite grounding for diversity, specifically unity and diversity. God is one God, three persons, according to Scripture. And so we're the people who actually have a grounding theistically for unity, but then also for appreciating diversity. So you do have differences in skin color, but that does not at all mean that you are a different species of humanity. Interestingly, Kerby, this is something that woke voices, critical race theorists, and Christians like me and like you agree on. The woke understand this. They know that there is not such a thing as race. Just about all of them avow that. But there's an idea called strategic essentialism that they use, such that they act as if race is real, even though they truly know, and they'll even tell you in a lot of cases it's not.
I work in the area of media, but I think we try to provide some perspectives that you don't see in the mainstream media. But this obsession with what was the race of the individual, and then fill in the blank, that shot someone or tried to race their car into the Capitol, and this almost complete obsession right now in journalism with reporting the race. And when the race doesn't fit the narrative, then it just goes down the memory hole. And that's something to pay attention to as well as a discerning Christian, right?
Oh, it definitely is. We have such groundings for appreciating different ethnicities. We recognize there is such a thing as Italian culture and Nigerian culture and Japanese culture, and while never absolutizing any culture and seeing it as perfect, we can appreciate all these different cultures. The nations are going to stream into the New Jerusalem, Revelation 21, at the end of all time, at the end of history, bringing gifts from their culture, essentially. And so we see that as a positive thing, but we do not use race or ethnicity to divide humanity into different species. We are all one humanity. We are all made in the image of God. We are all image bearers. We have all gone astray in Adam's real historical fall, Genesis 3. So we have a kind of sinful unity that's not a real unity. But then we know that there is only one way of coming back together. It's not through any worldly ideology. It's not through politics. It's not through philosophies. It is only through the gospel of grace. But wokeness tells us, yes, split humanity up into different groupings, and that's somehow going to make things more equal and more just. It's actually going to make us more divided.
If anything, the future, every nation, every tribe, right, comes together. Just before we take a break, let's talk about your book, and then when we come back, we'll talk about the conference again, because Christianity and Wokeness, how the social justice movement is hijacking the gospel and the way to stop it. It's coming out in July. Maybe you can get some early copies of that there for the conference in June. about 220 pages, and it goes through all sorts of details that relate to the whole issue of wokeness, and in particular, how to really address that issue. So while that's in the book, let's again mention that June 11th and 12th, you'll be trying to address that in terms of what the church can do. And if you want to go to the break right now, it is wokenessandgospel.org. And if you'd like to join us, perhaps you have some comments or questions. We have just a few more minutes with Owen, so I'm sure he'd be glad to respond to one of those. If not, I certainly have a lot more questions to get into. And so we'll talk about what this means in terms of justice, because that gets us into social justice. Is social justice the same as biblical justice? I think I know his answer to that one, but we've talked about that before on this program and how that all fits into the issue of wokeness. So this is a topic that we thought you needed to know about. If you find yourself saying, okay, you didn't cover all the topics I want to get into, that's why you need to go to the conference. They've got hundreds of people already signed up, but there's room still for you, and we want you to know about that now. So if you're outside of the Dallas area, you can get that plane flight and maybe even drive over here to find out more. We'll take a break, and we'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us real quickly, we'll see if we can slip in a phone call, but I do want to spend some time talking about the conference, one of the reasons we're here. And first of all, Owen, let me just mention the fact that, of course, you're a graduate of Southern Seminary, got your Ph.D. from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. We were talking off air about being the director of the Carl F.H. Henry Institute for Evangelical Engagement and much, much more. I did introduce you as well as the director of the Center for Public Theology, and I think the world of all the people
people up there at Midwestern. It's been a while since I've been up there. Matter of fact, last time I was at Midwestern, I was trying to slip away to go watch a Kansas City Royals game because I love baseball, by the way, although the Major League has changed my attitude on that. And in a few minutes, we're going to have opening day right here in Dallas. But anyway, so you are certainly one of the speakers. Then Daryl Harrison, if people are not familiar with him, Dean of Social Media at Grace to You, African-American, really help kind of look at that issue, right? Mm-hmm. So, again, he will bring some of that perspective, graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary. Of course, you also have Pastor Tommy Nelson. I can imagine all things he's going to say. He's been on the program with us before. Pastor Tom Buck, senior pastor of First Baptist Church in Lindale, Texas, and so will help us with some of that, and an individual, again, with graduate degrees from Dallas Theological Seminary, Southern Baptist Seminary, Moody Bible. Rodney Brown, right in there, and he's been the senior pastor of Metro Bible Church. And then Pastor Charles Stolfus, who's watching it right now, and I guess will be the MC. So that's a pretty good group. There'll be individuals giving you some of the theological, philosophical perspective. There are going to be some giving you some of the biblical material. And if nothing else, it's, as you said, going to be fairly practical. And it is something where if people sign up right now, they'll be able to get all that information. And I think they will go to the conference June 11th and 12th and not be disappointed.
Yeah, this is, as I said earlier, this is the world's first conference on wokeness, baby. So we are getting in early, and we are trying to help here. And there's not a lot of help on these issues. There's not a lot of help in the broader culture. There are some books that are trickling out. There's Cynical Theories and some others that you could mention. There's some good websites, Federalist, PragerU, those sorts of things. But there's not a lot of sustained attention to what this system is, the system that I call wokeness. And then, of course, in the Christian world, there's not a lot of answers given to what it is. We mentioned Daryl Harrison a minute ago. I just want to say a point there.
Yeah.
He and his friend Virgil Walker have a terrific podcast called Just Thinking. Just Thinking has rocketed to the top of the Apple Podcast charts, and it's because there is almost nothing out there that is strong water theologically about these issues. But when people do speak up, Kerby, we have seen this over and over again. When someone will help people think through what wokeness is, and then when someone will even more give an answer, a biblical answer to it, people rock to it. People are thrilled to hear it, and they want answers.
I would think so. I do want to get to a couple other issues, but one I mentioned before I went to the break, so I don't make a mistake of ignoring that, is the subtitle in your book is Social Justice. We've mentioned the word social justice, and I'm pretty sure I know what the answer is, but it's worth putting on the table. Is there a difference between biblical justice and this idea of social justice?
I think there is. It can be tough to trace it out because different people use the term to mean all sorts of things.
Sure.
But basically, biblical justice at root is retributive, meaning if you do something wrong, you pay for it. Our God is a perfectly just God. Justice is not a lesser part of his character. It's a part of his divine perfections. So we know that justice flows from the very character of God. And justice in particular is a problem for humanity because we all are sinners, and thus we all have the justice of God hanging over our heads. We all deserve an eternity in hell for our sin. And so God is just, and he will condemn all who do not have their sin paid for eternally. But the good news is, even though we have this sin problem, God is not only a just God, he is a merciful God. And so he extends mercy to us through the person of his Son who dies on the cross and rises from the grave in order that we would be saved, justified, and live forever. So God is perfectly just, perfectly merciful. But social justice says that justice is fundamentally a different thing, and it does not ground it in the character of God. Social justice is distributive justice. Think of that as leftist justice, meaning that everybody should have the same living conditions and not just the same starting conditions, but we owe people, we owe everyone the same outcome in life. So equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity.
Yeah, and I might just mention that when you talk about justice, we did this little booklet on a biblical view on criminal justice, because that's become kind of a big issue over the last couple of years. And so we wrote that even before some of the action was taking place this summer. And then, of course, the book that we have on a biblical view on racism, it gets us into some of those. So those are issues that we make available to those of you that are donors to the ministry. Of course, if you'd like to get a copy, we'll make those available as well. And don't forget, Ken, we have a conference coming up on wokeness and gospel wokenessandgospel.org. So wokenessandgospel.org. But what we're going to be dealing with, I think, in the future is more and more people trying to make us feel guilty for being white. Mm-hmm. And if you hear that from the pulpit, or you hear that from speakers, or you hear that maybe at a graduation ceremony, that should have your bell in your head going ding, 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 ding. That's wokeness, isn't it?
That is wokeness in action. Wokeness does not usually pop up through the form of a 700-page anthropology textbook that somebody is holding in their hand and shouting at you about, okay? So wokeness is broader than critical race theory, though it is driven by critical race theory. And yes, when you are hearing somebody indict you for your skin color, you are hearing wokeness talk. You are hearing it bark. And what we need to be very clear about, and I'm thankful to have even this opportunity to say, is that if you have been condemned and convicted for your skin color in any direction, including this so-called white supremacy that you're a part of for having white skin, you have been unfairly convicted. You have been wronged. You are not guilty in fundamental terms. And then as a Christian, if you hear this as a Christian in a church, if that pastor is standing up there condemning you for your white skin, you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, you need to seize Romans 8:1, and you need to know that there is no condemnation now for those who are in Christ Jesus. We can all sin. We can all incur earthly consequences for our sin, yes, but there is no status of condemned for anyone who has placed their faith and trust in Jesus Christ, including so-called white people.
And that's a good example of why you say that this is ultimately an attack on the gospel. And in your book and in the conference, you're going to talk about what we can do to combat that, right?
That is exactly my topic. What I just said, and listeners can probably hear the emotion in my voice as I say it, because I am very much convicted of the need to go to the Wokeness and the Gospel Conference in June and do my level best. I'm a tiny little reed in the wilderness, but to issue this word that there is no condemnation for those who are in Jesus Christ. And even before we start talking about the church, which is my primary burden, I'm a theologian, but even for ordinary so-called white people, they are sinners in need of Jesus Christ eternally, but they are not extra special sinners by virtue of their skin color. So this system of wokeness is sinister, and it is a system of condemnation, alienation, and division, and we need to overcome it by the blood of Jesus Christ.
One of the reasons why I want to emphasize the conference is you'll begin to find out that it has more to do than even race. For example, defund the police. That doesn't seem like it's race. The issue of whether or not to have an ID, a photo ID, when you vote in Georgia, you'll start seeing how this has made its way into all parts of society. So one last time, June 11th and 12th, it's at Denton Bible Church, and certainly we've talked about some of the great material that they have there, and it's wokenessandgospel.org. You can find everything you need right there, or just simply go to dentonbible.org. Either way, you'll find it. Owen, been great to have you in studio. When that book comes out, I want you to spend an hour with us talking about it. Is that okay?
I'd be delighted. Thank you so much.
I want to thank you for listening. We are spending a fair amount of time today talking about wokeness, but we will continue talking about that all through the week. And if you would like to know more, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. But we need to take a break. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yeah, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.